Thank you. I've been in risk management and compliance for about 25 years here in the Low Country. I served as risk management safety director for the city of Charleston before I moved over to the state. I've been with the state for about 6 years now. But again, I'll talk about some opportunities at the end for outreach, for education and training for each of you. So we're going to talk about hazard communication for a few minutes this afternoon. Does anyone know who can tell me what HAZCOM deals with? Oh, he's got a call. He can't answer the question. It's perfect timing. Do we know what HAZCOM deals with? It deals with chemicals. And with the equipment that you use, you are, right, always, whether you're using it or your clients are using it, you are dealing with chemicals. So when we provide training or presentations with outreach, just want to tell you what we do. We're really giving you insight into the standards, into the OSHA standards. You know, all of the states, we have 26 states who are state programs, and the rest of the country has, federal OSHA has jurisdiction over safety and workplace safety in the United States, but we all use the same standards. When federal OSHA, when United States Department of Labor or federal OSHA and the legislatures in Washington, when they can actually do something, they pass new legislation or they pass new standards. The state programs adopt those standards. So we're all using the same standards, but some states go above and beyond. So our requirement is that we are required to be at least as effective. South Carolina was actually the first state back in 1972, the first state to become a state program. South Carolina has some standards that are a little more strict, a few more requirements than the federal programs do. Cal OSHA has a lot of standards that are much more strict and stringent, but that's how we do it. Hazard communication deals with chemicals in the workplace, and our requirement to communicate the hazards of those chemicals to the employees or to the end users of the equipment. You've seen the GHS, seen it on the signage. This is something new that was added to the standard about 3 or 4 years ago now. The hazard communication standard has been around for a long time, for 20-some years. But with some changes about 3 years ago, now we have what's called the globally harmonized system. So when you see HAZCOM/GHS, that means it's globally harmonized. Well, what does that mean? That means that, as you'll see, we have standardized the format, the requirements, and the information on the safety data sheets. That's the primary change. And it's driven by an interesting fact. This change was driven by the United Nations. I don't know how the UN got involved, but they drove this change. And right now there are 96 or 97 countries that are now harmonized with the format of the safety data sheets and being able to provide information to the hazard information to your employees. The benefit is that if we go to another country, if you're doing work in another country, a non-English speaking country, you can look at their SDS sheet and you can look at the pictograms and other information and you can know what the hazards are. If you haven't seen them before, you're going to see them in the next few minutes. When we leave this class, you can go to another country and you can look at those SDS sheets and you can know immediately what the hazards are. And conversely, if someone is here in the United States and they have a language barrier, they don't speak or read English very well, they can look at our SDS sheets and they can know immediately what the hazards are. So that's part of the significant benefit of the new GHS globally harmonized system. So we are talking about, spoiler alert, I've already told you we're talking about chemicals, right, in the workplace, and our requirement and our ability to communicate the hazards of those chemicals. Toward the end, I'm also going to get you involved, probably you two since you're closest, in identifying some hazards. That's the standard, 1910-1200, you may have seen before. But when we're talking about what is a hazardous chemical, we don't get to decide. You and I don't decide what is a hazardous chemical, and if this chemical or this material that I have in my shop or on my work site, is it hazardous? We don't get to decide that. You and I don't get to decide that. The manufacturer, the scientists who are working for that manufacturer, they're making that decision. The bottom line is, if there is an SDS sheet for a chemical or material that we're using, if an SDS sheet exists for it, then we need to have it because it's considered a hazardous chemical. So hazardous chemicals are any chemical that can have a physical hazard, a health hazard, can be an asphyxiant, can be combustible, like combustible dust, a pyrophoric gas, or it's known as a hazard not otherwise classified, which might be a hazard or a chemical that has a hazard that is referred to in another standard, like an ANSI standard or something else. But that's a breakdown of what we're looking at when we're talking about hazardous chemicals. And there are a couple different types of hazards. There are physical hazards and there are health hazards. We're going to unpack those a little bit. And I mentioned we can look at, or someone else can look at, an SDS sheet in our country and know immediately what the hazard is, and that's one of the big benefits of the GHS change, is these pictograms. So if you have looked at an SDS sheet and you have seen these little red diamonds, that's what they are. So let's look at them and see if we can figure out what they are. So what do you think this top left one would represent? A chemical that is flammable. That's right. How about the next one? Those look like little test tubes. Corrosive. Yeah, that's a corrosive chemical. How about that one? Yep, that's a bomb going off, so that's an explosive. That's correct. That's a tough one. What kind of gas? No? It's a compressed gas. It's simply a compressed gas. Because that in itself is a hazard. If we don't have we don't have the cap on it restrained and that container isn't restrained and it falls over, we lose that valve, then that's the hazard. Okay, so compressed gas. How about that one? Your hair, it may set your hair on fire. And that is a serious, serious hazard. Because hair is expensive. Isn't it? That's right. It's an oxidizing agent. Okay, it's an oxidizer. So what does an oxidizer do in the presence of a flame or fire? It makes things much, much worse. Right? If we have a release of chlorine gas is an oxidizer. And if we have the presence of a flame, or you drive a vehicle through that green plume, you're going to have an engine runaway because there's an oxidizer. So that's the issue with an oxidizer. Or a pirate. Which one? It is poisonous. It's toxic. That's right. It's toxic. Ultimately, it is poisonous, but it's generally known as a health hazard, and we'll unpack what those can be. Yeah. Yes. That's true. Yeah. Yeah. Just that it is harmful, can be an irritant, but it's a harmful material. And of the 9, and this being the 9th one, OSHA does not have regulatory authority over this one. This is an environmental hazard or issue, so South Carolina DHEC or the EPA would have regulatory authority over the environmental factor. So those are the 9, and there are only 9. So those are the 9 pictograms. And so now you know what they stand for. So we can build on that. So I said we have physical hazards, have the potential for physical hazards and health hazards. So some of the physical hazards, and we've got a pretty significant physical hazard going on right here at this plant, right? So they can be flammables, explosives, oxidizers, reactives, water reactives, corrosives, gases under pressure, all of those are great examples of physical hazards. Health hazards, which we'll look at in a second. Does anyone remember the 1984 Bhopal, India incident with Union Carbide? Union Carbide was had a plant in Bhopal, India, and unfortunately had some significant maintenance issues with their plant. They were producing pesticides and herbicides at that plant. They had maintenance issues, and they had not repaired a lot of their alarm systems and automatic closure systems, and they had just removed some of them. And in December of 1984, and the Union Carbide plant, by the way, sat on top of a hill in the center of a town. And overnight, they had some heating of some chemicals. The alarms didn't go off because they had disactivated them. They had removed some self-closing systems and emergency systems, and there was a release of several chemicals. And the chemicals were heavier than air, and they were toxic chemicals. And they flowed down the hill into the town, and overnight, there were about 5,000 fatalities in the town. And over the next 15 years, they estimate about 50,000 people were significantly affected, medically affected, or succumbed to that exposure. So some examples of some of the more common health hazards: acute toxicity, corrosion, irritation, skin sensitizers, carcinogens, reproductive toxins, special organ toxins. We'll talk about respiratory, whether it's a respiratory or other, or a skin sensitizer or a desensitizer. Just think about this for a second. So, and how important all of these are. If, for example, we had you had a Connex or something else at a job site, or a storage room in your facility, and you stored some of your chemicals that you use with your equipment. And we walked into the room to get one of those containers, and we smelled a pungent odor, or we smelled something like sulfur or something out of the ordinary. And because of it had been too hot, and we had off-gas some fumes out of the container, or someone had left a lid off, or there had been a spill. I mean, whatever the reason is, but there's a gas, there's an odor in that room. So we go in, we smell that, we come back out, and we say, you know, that's unpleasant. So we're going to open the doors, maybe turn the fan on, and let it air out. Right? And so we give it a few minutes to air out. We leave that door open, and then we go back in, and we can't smell it anymore. And we say, good, problem solved. And we go in, and we either start working on what we're going to work on, or we grab whatever we're going to grab and come back out. If that happened to be a respiratory sensitizer or desensitizer, it's not that it has cleared out. Right? It's not that it had reduced in the parts per million to where it's no longer a danger, but it has desensitized our ability to smell it. And so now we're in a hazardous atmosphere, breathing that toxin or breathing whatever it is, the dangers of that chemical. So those are the health hazards associated with some of these chemicals. And generally, looking at the effects, generally short-term or acute versus chronic, very often we see this with lots of different types of chemicals. An acute, we call it an acute exposure or short-term exposure, might just be something as mild as runny nose, runny eyes, your nose might be burning, your throat may be burning a little bit. Those are all considered acute symptoms, right? Coughing, runny nose, tearing of the eye, we can smell it. Those are the acute effects of exposure. But then we have the chronic effects, and the more dangerous chronic effects, which unfortunately are not as noticeable, right? It's like hearing loss over a long period of time. We don't notice it until one day we realize that there's an issue. And that is the same with chemical exposures, our chronic long-term effects. This is an example of some internal organs that were affected. And it took 30 years before some of the symptoms started showing up. Let's talk about pathways into the body, how chemicals can enter the body. Inhalation through ingestion, absorption, or through a puncture. Inhalation, it's pretty obvious, right? If we can smell it, and by the way, doing a smell test is not a good way of determining if you have an exposure to a chemical, right? Never do a smell test. What is that? Don't pick up the container and smell it to see what it is. Right? And that is the most common route of exposure for chemicals, is inhalation. Fire-related smoke inhalation accounts for, you see that number, about 80-90% of all fire-related deaths is through smoke inhalation. Ingestion. I'm going to back up before I show you that, and I'll just warn you before I show you that. That was a fatality from someone who ingested sulfuric acid. But we're all really smart people, right? I go into a work site, I'm thinking there is no way that I'm going to ingest someone's toxic chemical. But how can it happen? Because unfortunately it does happen, and very commonly. An example of how we can have an ingestion of a chemical, of a toxic chemical. Say again? An unmarked container. Labeling, that's right. Yeah. And how many of us have siphoned? Yeah. Well, here's another one. You know, if you have in your facility or your work site, if you have a kitchen or a break room, and we have our lunch in there, or we go in there to get a drink out of the refrigerator, and someone's working with a chemical, and they have it on their hands, and whatever the chemical is, and they walk into the facility or to that work site, and they grab that doorknob for that kitchenette or that break room. It's on their hands, and then they go to the refrigerator and they grab that handle on that refrigerator, and then they grab their food or their bottle of water and they start drinking. And we come in behind them and we grab that same doorknob, right? And then we grab that same handle on that refrigerator door and pull it out. Then we grab our lunch and we start eating it. And we have just ingested what they have been working with all day. So a couple of ways that we can really protect ourselves from chemicals is wash our hands constantly. And there are several exposures, not just chemicals, but also bloodborne pathogens and all the hepatitis strains, B and C. So you can't wash your hands too often. If you have those little hand sanitizer dispensers, use those every time you walk by one. And also wear PPE, whether it's on your hands or if you are around a chemical and the SDS sheet says must wear respiratory protection, we need to wear it. Okay. Very quickly, so if unpleasant pictures, if they affect you, you can certainly look away for a moment, but I'll just show you very quickly. And this was from an unlabeled container, and there was sulfuric acid in it. They put it into a glass, and he thought it looked like the glass he'd been drinking from, and so he consumed some. And that was a fatality. So that's over. Absorption through the skin, contact with the skin. In South Carolina a few years ago, about 3 years ago, we had a young man working in a facility and reached up onto a shelf to pull down a corrosive, acidic chemical, a liquid, which, hope you know, by the way, it's not a good idea to store liquids or chemicals above about chest level. You don't want to place them up overhead, and this is exactly why. The container, the lid was not closed on it, and as he pulled it off, it's natural for us to rotate it, and it spilled on him, on his face, and onto his clothes. And it was burning him, so he took his clothes off and he jumped in the shower. They had shower facilities there, fortunately, and he showered off, and he realized he needed to go to the hospital, so he put his clothes back on and drove to the hospital, and the amount that was absorbed through his skin was fatal to him. So absorption is certainly a significant issue. And puncture wounds, any opening, don't think it requires an action of a puncture. Any break in the skin, really, whether it's a nick, whether it's a paper cut, whether it's a scab that is less than 72 hours old, still can be an entry site. So any break in the skin or our eyes, nose, mouth, mucous membranes, we get that into that. That's going to be considered ingestion or through a puncture wound. So skin is a great barrier until it is broken, and then it is a direct pathway for us. So those are the 4 routes of exposure. Okay. Has a communication plan. So when you are dealing with chemicals in your workplace, or you're utilizing chemicals, or employees are, and those chemicals have SDS sheets, we have to have, standard requires that we have to have a hazard communication program. And these are the requirements of the program. We've got to have a written plan. Those are available. If you don't have one, you can Google OSHA HAZCOM template, and there's a blank. You just fill in the blanks. Easy to put into your binder. So we've got to have a written plan. We've got to have a chemical inventory. So I'll talk about how we do that in just a second. We've got to have labels, right? Got to have labels on all of our chemicals and all of our containers. We have to provide training to the employees about the HAZCOM program and about the chemicals that we have. And you have to have SDS documents. And where do those documents need to be? Have to be accessible. That's right. If we've got somebody working 30 miles away at a job site, they have to be accessible to the employee who's using that chemical. There's lots of ways that we can do that. It's pretty simple to do, but they have to be accessible. That's right, and that's that key word. So developing chemical inventory, pretty simple. You look at what we've purchased. Right, just walk around and put your eyes on what you have. Or think about your work practices, what's required. I want you to be aware of this one, though. If there's a chemical in your facility or on your job site, and your employees are exposed to it, but you did not provide that chemical, you are still responsible for protecting your employees from it. So how can we have a chemical in our office or in our facility or on our work site that we didn't provide that an employee might be exposed to? Somebody else brings in, cleaning crew brings in, another contractor brings in, or we bring in. If we're coming in with a bag and we have acetone in our purse or our bag, which is, commonly fingernail polish remover, that's now in the workplace. So I want to caution your employees about 2 things, about bringing chemicals into the workplace that may not be work-related, but also about bringing chemicals in that they think, I think this might do a better job. Because if it's in the work site being used and your employees are in the proximity of it, could be exposed to it, you're going to be responsible for it.
Always amazed me that you can have stuff at home that your wife and kids are exposed to.
Yeah.
But if you bring it to the workplace, you're in deep stuff.
Yeah. I'm going to talk a little bit about that too. So it used to be called material safety data sheets. We called it for 30 years MSDS sheets, and I, like a lot of other folks, still will once in a while say MSDS sheet. Fortunately, they are now called safety data sheets. What do you remember about the old MSDS sheets? How many sections? You ever actually looked at an old MSDS sheet? How many sections did the MSDS sheet have, or what did it have on it? Do you recall? Have you ever looked at one? Okay. It was 10 or 11 or 8, yeah. And just some basic information. The new SDS sheets, has anyone looked at one? 10 pages long, but how many sections? So when we're talking about grouping the information, 16 sections. And here's the difference in an SDS sheet and an MSDS sheet. Is SDS sheet, it is absolutely 16 sections, and it is very specific in order what topic, what information has to be displayed in order in what section. The old MSDS sheet could be any order they wanted to do. SDS sheet now, 16 sections, and these are the sections. So identification, number one, identification is the name of the chemical, right? The trade name or the generic name, whatever the name of that chemical is. It's also going to have information about the manufacturer, contact information for the manufacturer, which may not be so important to us, but it's really important to firefighters or someone else when they're coming in to deal with a spill or a fire, and they encounter this, and they look at the SDS sheet, and it's not reacting how it's supposed to be reacting, so it's obviously been mixed with something else. And so it's important to have the contact information, so that's why that's on there. Hazard identification, we're going to look at what is included in that, such as hazard identification is going to be where our pictograms are. So Section 2 is going to be specific dangers about signal words, specific information, and the pictograms is going to be in Section 2. Composition, ingredient information, again, firefighters, first responders, or scientists are going to be concerned with that. First aid measures, Section 4, which is what we're going to do for someone if they have been exposed to it, or what we should not do for someone if they've been exposed to it. Right? If we have a self-reactive, like magnesium, if we have magnesium powder, and it's they had an exposure into their eyes. Well, we don't want to flush their eyes for 10 minutes, right? Because the issue. So very important. Number 4, first aid, what we can do, what we should not do for them as well. 5, firefighter measures. Accidental release measures, which is another way of saying if we have a spill. So don't forget number 5. A lot of folks look right over, number 6. A lot of folks look right over that because they think that's a HAZWOPER issue and we call 911 and they can come in and deal with it, but that's not. That's as simple as a spill. So how are we, if we spill 1 gallon of it, how are we going to clean it up? What do we need to do? 7, handling and storage, where to store it, how to store it, exposure control, personal protection. So PPE. Number 8 is PPE, what PPE we need to wear while exposed to it. Physical chemical properties, heavier than air, lighter than air, stability, reactivity, if it reacts with other chemicals. Toxicological information. We are concerned about that, and we're going to look at that a little bit. But the next 4, OSHA, again, doesn't really have a regulatory authority over these: ecological, disposal, transport, and other regulatory. And then 16 other information. So of these 16, which sections would you consider the most important? What numbers?
1 through 16.
Well, they all are important. Thank you. Yeah. Okay. And certainly 1, 2, 4, and 8. 1, 2, 4, and 8 are absolutely the ones that you want to put your eyes on for any chemical that you have in your workplace. And as I said a few minutes ago, we don't get to decide. Lots of folks ask, do I need an SDS sheet for this chemical? Do I need an SDS sheet for the toner in my printer? Well, we don't get to decide. Look it up, Google it, and see if an SDS sheet exists for it, and if it does, then yes, you have to have one. We don't get to decide if it's a hazardous chemical. So we don't get to decide if an SDS sheet exists for it and you have that chemical in your workplace. You must have that SDS sheet, and it must be readily accessible. Right? What that means is if it's in the work site, if there's a potential for an employer to use it, then at any moment, anyone must be able to put their hands on that, which means it cannot be locked in an office. It cannot be on a computer that requires a password unless everyone knows the password. Okay, it has to be free and accessible. And our SDS sheets have to be maintained for 30 years in a file somewhere that you can put your fingers on after discontinuing its use. So you need to have, and I know that things change and we change products, so that you're going to have a few binders of that, of prior chemicals. But that is a requirement. So what do you think about chemicals that we can use at home, like you just mentioned that your wife and children are using, like Windex or Clorox or something else? We can buy it at home. We can buy it at Walmart right now, and we don't have to have an SDS sheet for it at home. So if we're using that in the workplace, do we have to have SDS sheets for them in the workplace? Well, yeah, but how the standard kind of molds it is that if we are using a product that's designed for home use and labeled for home use, if we're using it in the workplace, if we are using it in the quantity and condition that we would use it at home, then we don't have to have an SDS sheet. So if we go to the store and we buy one bottle of Clorox that's labeled for home use, and we have one on hand and we keep it in the closet and occasionally we use it, then there's that exception where we wouldn't have to have an SDS sheet because we're using it in the quantity and fashion that we would at home. But if we're buying 10 bottles and we're transferring it into a spray bottle or whatever the chemical is, right, and we have a custodial staff who is walking around with it all day long in their hands, and they're using it throughout the day, that's not a normal use fashion that we would be at home. And so if it's outside of the quantity or normal use and fashion that we would do at home, then we do have to have an SDS sheet for it. What's the best practice? Have an SDS sheet for it regardless. Yes, sir.
Previous years, we were told anything that's eye irritant or skin irritant has to have a safety data sheet. So you're saying that changed?
What state are you in?
Tennessee and Kentucky.
Okay.
And that was by EPA.
Anything that's an irritant or a corrosive?
They said eye irritant
An eye irritant.
or skin irritant. And that classifies a lot of things.
That does.
We were told that an
Well-
employee is using it. And that, notice the other standard where you provided it to an employee, then you have to give them, they have a right to know.
Yeah. So I think we all agree best practice would be absolutely have an SDS sheet for it, without question. Yeah. No, there are vertical standards. There are parts of the standard that will address something, and then there are blanket statements like this one. So, yes, there are, and I certainly know corrosives. I have to think about irritants, but absolutely corrosive. If you've got a corrosive material, you've got to have one. You also have to have, and you are manipulating that container, you're transferring that corrosive, you've got to have eye wash stations available as well. Yeah, so, yeah, it's a good point. There are these vertical parts within the standards that will address those kind of
What I
issues.
was running a lot into is that a lot of the big department stores have got a lot of the same chemicals, but they got a lot of the same components in them, and
Yeah.
they don't have to pass out those safety data sheets.
That's
They
right.
have to be asked for.
When you're buying, yep, that's right. You're right. But it's our responsibility.
Requirement go further than our, if we provide the SDS sheet, then we don't have to do nearly the labeling that they do in the stores, is what I know.
Right. I agree with that. So let's talk about labeling. You recognize that? This is the old, called the NFPA diamond. It's been around for a very long time. And if you remember, we had 0 through 4 in these spaces, for a health hazard, for a fire hazard, for a reactive, and then a special hazard. That meant do not mix with water, and 0 would be a minimal or no hazard, and the 4 would be the highest hazard. You'll still see these, and it's okay to have these as long as you also have the newer type of label attached. So you don't have to peel these off, but there's a new labeling requirement that we're going to look at in just a minute. So breaking down the pictograms, so the health hazards, examples of some of the health hazards related to that pictogram: carcinogen, reproductive toxicity, respiratory sensitizer, desensitizer. Right, we talked about those. Flames, so flammables, pyrophoric, self-heating, self-reactive, peroxides. So that warning or irritant, right, is what that one stood for. It can be an irritant, it can be a sensitizer, acute toxicity, respiratory tract, gas cylinder, so gases under pressure. We explained what that one was. Corrosive. And we're going to look at some SDS sheets and actually look at what the requirements are of skin corrosions and eye damage that can come from these chemicals. The explosives, self-reactives, oxidizers, we unpack that one. Environment, we're not dealing with, and acute toxicity. So the skull and crossbones, which was toxic, right? This one says acute toxicity, but this one also says acute toxicity. So what's the difference there? This one can be fatal. Right, that skull and crossbones, that toxic can be fatal, and this is more of an irritant that we'd be concerned about. So the pictograms themselves, going to have that red border. Can't ever have a red border just blank without anything in it. There's going to be one of those 9 pictograms in it. Something to be aware of if you're going to make copies of your SDS sheets to give to personnel. The purpose in the red border is that it draws your eye to it. As soon as you open that page, it draws your eye to it. So we stick our, and this is just for your information, we stick our SDS sheet in our copying machine and we hit 10 copies. Now they're grayscale, black and white, right? So if you have a color copier, you can certainly use that if you're going to distribute these to your employees. No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying as long as you have one, you're okay.
We typically print SDS and put it on everything larger than a 5-gallon container when we send it out as a courtesy and keep it accessible, but those have to be in color?
Yeah. I would recommend that, yes. Okay, so the new style labeling under the GHS and the new HAZCOM requirements, it's got to have that product identifier up top, which is, remember, that trade name, and supplier information, which is that manufacturer and their contact information, their telephone numbers. Got the pictograms. You remember what these pictograms stand for? What are they? Flammable and harmful or irritant. Okay. All right, so we've got to have a couple pictograms, have to have the hazard statement, which is very specific to that. This one says highly flammable liquid and vapor, causes severe eye irritation. Signal word, there are only 2 signal words. You're only going to see 2 signal words. There's warning and danger. Warning and danger, and obviously danger is going to be the more serious hazard. And then precautionary information about that chemical in the body of the label, like avoid contact with eyes and skin, wear appropriate PPE, flush eyes with water for at least 15 minutes while holding eyelids open. I want to address that for just a minute. When you read your SDS sheet, and we're going to look at one. I think I have one that addresses eye wash. When we have a chemical and the SDS sheet says very specifically, if there's exposure to the eyes, flush the eyes for 5, 10, 15, or 20 minutes, whatever the time frame is. And they may also go further and say, if wearing contacts, remove contacts and flush eyes. Hold your eyes open and flush for 15 or 20 minutes. We unfortunately see very often that when someone has an exposure to a chemical, they go to the eye wash station or go to the water fountain and they will start flushing their eyes, and they'll do that for about 2 or 3 minutes, and then they'll stop. Because 2 or 3 minutes with your face down in a water fountain is a long time, but it'll start feeling better, and so we stop. And we have a corrosive in the eye, and we stop that soon. That's going to continue to do damage, and we're going to look at some of the damage that it can cause. But if it says, and here's my point, if it says flush your eyes for 15 minutes, flush them for 15 minutes. It doesn't say 2 minutes. There's a reason that it says 10 minutes or 15 minutes or 20 minutes. Okay, so follow the directions on what it's, the directives on what it's saying about flushing the eyes, please. Another general format under the new labeling has the pictograms up top, has the chemical. signal word, information in the body, and even first aid in this one, and then the contact information. So again, this is the content. It doesn't have to be in this format. It has to have this content on the new labels, even though we can, and you still will see the old NFPA diamonds. That's okay to still have them on there, but we have to have the new GHS compliant labels. We can create our own labels. And there are different reasons why folks will do that. If we are in a hazardous atmosphere, a corrosive atmosphere, we know the labels will get worn sometimes. So you can print your own. The requirements for that basically is that it has to contain the same information as the standard label contains now. You can print the printable types. You can print them yourself if you need to. You know, if you're distributing it into smaller containers, you can print your own and place those on those containers. So here's another interesting part about the standard. So when transferring chemicals using portable containers for immediate use, does the container have to be labeled? Does it have to be labeled if we're transferring it into a portable container? Well, what the standard says about this is that if an employee is going to transfer it into a small portable container like a spray bottle, and they're going to maintain possession of that container for the entirety of their shift, and they're going to use all of the content of that container within that shift, then it does not have to be labeled. But how can you guarantee that that's going to happen? You can't. If they take a restroom break, if they go to lunch, you know you're not going to take it with them. It's not going to be in their possession. And what are the chances of them actually using all of it? So again, there's another exception. We're going to have to, but best practice and the smartest thing to do is absolutely label everything. Label every container. What do you think? When is HAZCOM training required for your employees? Yep. Initial job assignment, when they're assigned in that position where they're going to have that initial exposure to a chemical, then they have to have received HAZCOM training. And anytime there's a change, if we're bringing a new product, if we're changing a process that's going to change or increase a level of exposure to a chemical, then we need to have some training. Now, it doesn't have to be a formal classroom setting. It can be a conversation. Any training that you do, though, whether it's a conversation or it's formal or you're bringing somebody in, just as a free tip, always document it. Always have a roster, put their name on it, have them sign it, and either attach, if you have information that was provided, attach that to that. Because one of the sayings nationwide, if there's an incident or an investigator comes in or anything happens, they're always going to ask for at least 3 years worth of training records. And if you haven't documented it, the saying is, if it doesn't exist, it didn't happen. So you've got to be able to document all of your training. So we've all got to know, your employees have to know some basics about HAZCOM. So where are the SDS sheets located and how can they access them? They have to know that. And how to access them. If it's on a computer, wherever it is, if they have to ask someone to get it out of a library, whatever it is, the method that they need to gain access to them. The labeling system that you use, whether you're using the commercially provided or your own. The areas where the chemicals are present in your workplace and what processes are being used that are using those chemicals. And the hazards associated with the chemicals. How do we know the hazards of a chemical? The SDS sheet. The SDS sheet explains them. And how do we protect ourselves from the chemicals? That's from PPE, that's from work practice controls. All of that also is going to be on the SDS sheets. So what's wrong with this picture? So, thank you. That's the easier answer. So what is this chemical? We don't know because it's unlabeled. This one has labels, but it's illegible. So it's unlabeled. We've got chemical-soaked rags that aren't contained. Containers are open. I don't know that that's an approved funnel for that chemical that he's using. So a lot of things, yeah. He said everything's wrong. So this one's cleaned up. It's a little bit better. Things are labeled now. The containers are closed. We've got an appropriate storage container for the debris. How about these guys? Tell me what's wrong. Well, it is. Unfortunately, it is. Okay, so you saw that first. So what is this? It's a parts cleaner, which uses what kind of liquid? Generally, yeah, gasoline or white gas or something that's very flammable. Yeah. And it's unlabeled. And there's a label there, but that's illegible. What about his PPE? Yeah, he should be wearing some other type of PPE. These leather gloves are going to absorb that, and that's a pathway for absorption or burn to his skin, right? Yeah, he's smoking. But he's wearing his glasses, and his forehead is very well protected, right? And beyond him, the guy in the background, he's running a torch. Yeah, so a lot of room for improvement in that situation, right? So they cleaned it up a little bit. I never did see a good label on this, but they got everything else cleaned up. Yeah, no smoking while you're doing the parts cleaning. Yeah. Okay, so these were the dates in South Carolina, which I think matched federal requirements. So we needed to have training on the new standard back as early as 2013, but it is fully effective and being enforced at this point. So questions so far? We're not done yet, but questions so far? Yes, sir. It's for sale. I got a CD. I'll be in the lobby selling them after class. Yeah, I'll email Tracy a copy of it, and she can put it on the website or distribute it to you. Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk about what chemicals you actually use in your workplace or your clients will use with the equipment that you're dealing with. So what kind of chemicals do you think we might encounter? Sodium hydroxide, okay.
All kinds of alkaline detergents. Solvents.
So solvents, degreasers. Okay. So, whew. Okay. Good stuff. All right. So, small quantities? Hopefully, yeah. So let's look at a couple of SDS sheets. So this is just a degreaser. Okay. 200. I think that's the yes, the product name. That's actually the product name there. So this is section 1. This is product identifier, right? Name, contact info for the producer. That is not poison control. That is Chemtrec. Yeah. Yes, they do. And this is an actual SDS sheet that I pulled this morning. Yes. Yes. Yeah. And that, by the way, yes, that is not poison control. Yeah. So section 2.
On that SDS sheet, if you got Chemtrex listed, you have to be paying Chemtrex. If you're not, and you put Chemtrex's number on there, you're in trouble.
They have to have the product in their database, so when they call, they give them the product names and they pull it up and there's also another one called InfoTrack that
Right.
we use, but there's, it has to be 24/7, 365.
Yeah. And I am not advertising Chemtrec, by the way. I just copied their SDS sheet. So that is right off their SDS sheet. Okay. So section 2, this classification. Signal words, danger. What is that? Can you see? Can you see the pictogram? What is that? Yeah, that's corrosive. That's a corrosive. That's right. Causes severe skin burns to the eye and severe eye damage. So precautionary statements, things we do not want to do. This one, you notice that one says, call the Poison Control Center. Section 4, first aid. And again, it goes into a little more information about, harmful if swallowed, causes eye burns, causes significant. So in case of eye contact, immediately flush, 15 minutes. If easy to do so, remove contact lenses. Skin contact tells us what to do. Inhalation, remove the fresh air, which is what usually most of them will indicate. It says personal precautions, use personal protective equipment. So we go down to section 8, which is PPE, to see what we need to be wearing. Accidental release, which is a spill, put on PPE. Safety eyewear recommended. Chemical resistant gloves are recommended. So that's so degreaser is pretty common for your group. And toxicological information. It's corrosive to the eye, it's corrosive to skin. All right, so let's look at bleach. Okay, section 1, identification information. Tell you what, let's do this. I made a copy of this one. Bleach. So just take a look through. So you're going to look at sections 1, 2, 4, and 8, right? So I'm going to give you a minute to look at section 2, which is going to be the hazards associated with this chemical. And then look at 4 very quickly, and then look at section 8 for PPE. And I'll give you a moment just to look at that, and then just tell us what you notice, what you see. What did you read? Okay, so it's odoriferous, has a distinct odor. We need ventilation if it's concentrated. Water will dilute it. Okay, so what are the hazards? In section 2, what does it discuss the hazards are? Okay, it's a corrosive, right? It'll cause serious eye burns. It'll cause permanent eye injury. It's also corrosive for the skin, which will cause skin burns. Okay. Yes, sir.
I'd like to ask a question, because I've had this happen. We as salespeople, when we go out and make a sale, we sell a degreaser. I've now learned it's our responsibility to make sure that the man that's gonna be using knows how to use it. Because the people that they work for don't train them. So when you got an employee that gets degreaser in his eyes, you as the salesperson and the company you work for will be held responsible for that, because they read on there and says, well, do I have to wear gloves? Do I have to wear eyeglasses?
So who's holding you responsible? Is that a civil liability or is that a regulatory?
I'm not sure. We got it took care of, but we are supposed to train people that we sell that stuff to, because it falls right back onto us because we sold the product.
My question would be, well, then why is the manufacturer who's selling it to you not doing that? Why are they not responsible for training you on it? I don't know how we connect those dots. But, so, yes, sir. Go ahead.
Now, that's where you have to deliver an MSDS sheet, or SDS sheet with it.
Right.
If you deliver that SDS sheet with it, and it's taped to the container, and you have them sign that they have received it,
See, that's what we didn't do. Right, now I have them, everyone signed, they received that safety data sheet.
Yeah, and so from the regulatory side of EPA, of OSHA, of all the regulatory agencies, it is the responsibility of the employer whose employees are using it and exposed to it for the training, for the communication of the hazard.
A guy standing bystander got the degreaser splashed in his eyes, we had to sit, he had to go to the hospital, we had to pay all the bills.
Yep. That's tough.
Nearly put him blind.
So anything else on this SDS sheet that's noteworthy that you want to mention that you saw? Anything else? Keep it locked up. Okay, here's one that I just saw. So immediately call Poison Control Center. If swallowed, do not induce vomiting. Right? It's caustic, it's an acid, so we know the secondary damage that can be caused. Remove clothing. But again, some people would not know that without looking at that SDS sheet. And a lot of the chemicals that you mentioned have very specific hazards and very specific requirements, and we're not going to know without looking at those SDS sheets. All right, first aid measures, all of those. Accidental release or a spill. How to clean it up. What PPE we need to wear. Eye wash stations, again, if we are transferring corrosive chemicals into another container, if we're going to pour it into another container, standard says we're required to have eye wash stations, and they're required to be within close proximity where that action is occurring. Right. Okay. Questions? Yes, sir.
I saw something advertised for a bleach additive that covers the odor recently. So if a consumer buys bleach and then adds the odor covering agent, are they the manufacturer when they start mixing those things together? How does that play out? I hear other stories of people saying, oh, this chemical works better if I mix this one with it, then go and use it.
They're going to have both SDS sheets for those. The real issue is what chemical reaction has occurred between those two. Like if we mix Clorox with ammonia.
You're gonna need all.
That's right. So, and that's the issue, is what's being produced from that chemical reaction and what that new chemical is. And you can't reasonably be expected to have the SDS sheet for that resulting off-gassing chemical, right? But you do have to have the SDS sheet for that, the two main chemicals.
Is the
Yeah.
customer doing the mixing or is he doing the mixing?
When you're
Customers
blending
involved,
product,
yeah, you know,
to sell the blended product, you have to produce a new SDSD.
Yes.
You have to send it, have it registered, and then you have to get all the testing done to
Yeah.
see if it is corrosive and all the things that go with it.
Yeah, well-
That's a new product when you blend it.
I agree
Yeah.
with you, but in the marketplace, we see all these additives. for
And
different-
what I'm talking about is on site, on a job site, they're mixing these two. They don't have to have the SDS sheet for the new chemical, but if you're blending it in shop and you're selling that new product, then absolutely, yeah. Yeah, good question.
About 2 days worth of work every time you do this.
Yeah. Okay, quick post-test. Everybody loves a pop quiz. Your employer is required to have a written HAZCOM program that defines how hazards are accommodated to employees. Yes, obviously. True. Outside contractors must provide SDS sheets, labels, and other info to employees whenever outside hazardous materials are brought into your workplace. What do you think? Well, must. Okay, well and this is the wording actually in the standard. It's a must. You know, there's a should and there's a must or a shall. So must or shall is not an option, right? So that is true. If we have a contractor coming into your facility doing work and bringing chemicals in, they have to provide those SDS sheets to you so you can have them available for your employees. Yes, sir.
How about a customer that brings in a machine for service that has an unknown chemical? Is that burden of liability on?
Oh,
Could we turn away the
on.
A lot of questions with acids and say, don't bring that into our shop, or what do you?
That's a real situation. Yeah. So if it's an unknown chemical, then what you have to do, you obviously can't provide an SDS sheet for it, but you have to treat it as worst case scenario. So have them put on PPE. If you think you know what it is and it requires a respirator, have them in a respirator. But the only thing that you can do is treat it as worst case. If someone's going into an IDLH immediately dangerous to life and health atmosphere, and they don't know what it is, they have to wear everything possible and wear all PPE. So you treat it as though it's something really nasty and wear your PPE appropriately. That's a good question. Where are safety data sheets and products in your workplace? Do your employees know where they are if they are being exposed? Which signal word on the label represents the more severe hazard? Of the signal words, danger does. Skull and crossbones stands for what? Which pictogram is that? Okay. Toxic. Skull and crossbones is a toxic pictogram. Safety data sheets have to be available to all employees for all hazardous products and materials in the workplace. Yes. Even if someone else has brought it in. Even if an employee has brought it into the workplace because they think that chemical will work better than what you're providing them, now you are responsible for having an SDS sheet for that chemical. So it's worth having a conversation with your employees about. All containers that contain hazardous chemicals in the workplace must have an identifying label. True. How many sections are there on the new safety data sheet? 16. That's correct. And of the 16, can they be listed in any order the company chooses to? No, it has to be that specific list in that specific order. South Carolina OSHA, and I know most of us are not from South Carolina. Again, South Carolina is a state program. And while we have compliance enforcement, we also, as I mentioned at the onset, we also have our outreach and education. We have trainers, we have consultants. Consultants will come out and do a walkthrough of your facility. And I mention this because all state programs as well as federal have, some call it different things. Some are Office of Voluntary Programs, OVP. We call it O&E, which is outreach and education. But we all perform the same task. We have no conversation with the compliance officers. Nothing gets transferred over to compliance to deal with. So you can request from your state, or if you're a federal state, they'll come in and the consultants will do a walkthrough with you. They'll identify the issues that you have. If you're lacking programs or written programs, they will help you develop your written programs. They can identify training issues that you have. If you haven't provided HAZCOM or bloodbornes or electrical or lockout, whatever the training need is, you can contact trainers with OSHA, and they'll come out and we provide training to your employees at your location at no cost to you. So I think it's a pretty good program. It's a pretty good deal. It's a win-win. It really is a win-win. So for South Carolina OSHA, you Google South Carolina OSHA, click it, you go to this site, and it's as simple. You don't even have to talk to a person. You can just click on training or consultation, fill out the form, submit it, and somebody will call you back the next day. So any other questions about HAZCOM? Any questions about any other standard or issue that you want to talk about? Yes, sir.
I would highly recommend that everybody call their appropriate state. About 4 years ago, 5 years ago, we had the federal DOT walk in on us. And it wasn't the educational department. The old boy flagged his badge. Was there for 3 days. We had to show how much inventory we had January, how much we had December 31st, and how much we bought. We had to show everything, all the shipping labels. You don't, and all your containers had to be
Had to be placarded. Yeah, DOT wants them placarded.
But anyway, that guy went through it with a fine tooth comb, and luckily we had a safety engineer that took his job to heart,
Well, it's never a good day when compliance enforcement of any regulatory agency shows up at your door. So one way to mitigate that and make it less painful is, just like you said, to call the folks who will come in and do it for you, will help you identify. And there are no financial penalties when you do it this way through outreach and education or OVP. They ask you to fix it, you fix it, and you're prepared for the day when the bad guy knocks on the door. Yeah, so thank you. Okay, so I'm going to be around for a few minutes if anybody has any questions. Appreciate you being here this afternoon. I appreciate you. I appreciate you being here. I'm glad we've had some great weather that you've been able to enjoy, because tomorrow we're not going to have good weather. We're going to have a tropical storm coming through. So welcome to Charleston. Thank you, folks.